Well, first I want to thank these five incredible speakers. I think you gave us all a lot to think about, and I think the range of presentations was pretty impressive. We had the beginning with the Garden of Eden, and we sort of had the end of sustainability. So I think there's quite a diversity, I think, in the positions. So I'm going to first make some general observations as a bit of a response, and hopefully sort of try to turn that into a question to start the conversation. One thing that I found very striking and that perhaps was common to the five was that the sort of environment that was represented was always political. And I think this kind of political dimension was accessed at different scales or through different means. Janette's, that we just ended on, she presented a taxonomy of contending policies around ecological issues. I think in Ed's even we saw a kind of political dimension perhaps in that the Garden of Eden was used as a kind of cipher through which complex and competing claims to the sort of form of nature that it represented reflected, its contemporary ideas around what the sort of laws of nature are and the laws of what the relationship should be between culture and nature, perhaps. And Ellen presented or sort of advocated for the politics of everyday life to sort of move us away from maybe a top-down approach of sustainability. So I think these all sort of pointed toward perhaps a fundamental difficulty in environmental thinking, which is that environment defies limits or enclosures. It resists divisions and separations that characterize or often characterize political or economic means of assigning ownership, responsibility, identity, and value. So perhaps while the first three that I mentioned parsed out a contested space, Nicholas, I thought it was interesting that the fake estates sort of found an uncontested space in the city, or one that sort of fell out of these organizing structures, but that through kind of amassing those sites, they were able to have a visibility and maybe an agency in the city. And I think Vandana, as a kind of historical project, that you were sort of also finding maybe an uncontested space between modernism and the history of sustainability. So I just wanted to sort of start with that, and I will turn it over, but I also wanted to point out, or I was reminded of a heated discussion that I heard recently about public space. And this debate went on until a suggestion from the crowd was made at the symposium to substitute the phrase public space with that of the commons, shifting the terms of the debate from space to resources and their ongoing negotiation. So I guess to try to turn this into a question, I was wondering about whether and which frameworks are needed to be incorporated, and I don't think this is necessarily other disciplines. And as Ellen put it, I think quite nicely, that perhaps within the discipline we have techniques and perhaps our own frameworks to work with environment. But I think, like the commons or territory or some of these other terms, what frameworks do we see as being incorporated in order to perhaps be more precise with what we're talking about, because maybe we're not even all talking about the same thing when we use this word environment.
I guess I would dive in and say that I think one of the historic figures that we definitely encounter in contemporary environmental discourse sorry. Can you hear me now? Okay. In some of your frustration, Ellen, and in certainly in your presentation, Janette, I saw the phantom of the closed system of the spaceship Earth, which it was the last slide I showed briefly. I'm going to bend the rules and sort of extend my presentation a little bit, but we saw that figure before. I dropped that slide in, Susan, when you put it there, because I think it's really important to understand historically that image of the whole Earth, which I showed in the orientation in which it was actually shot, the capsule was America was pointing with Antarctica as up, and that's and it's always turned around in its to sort of prioritize a conventional view of the Earth. But that image is a real lie in at least several ways. One, it was used. First of all, it was the product of the environmental movement, not the cause of it. It was only lobbying by the environmentalists, Stuart Brand and others, that made the trajectory of Apollo 17 was made different from any other mission to allow that photograph to be taken of the unshadowed Earth, because the Earth was necessarily half in shadow because the moon was always half in shadow when they landed on it, so they could see the relief on it. And then the second thing is that image only replaced a painted Earth on the Earth Day flag after several years of Earth Day already having been taken place. But the spaceship Earth, I think Fuller really used that image in a very false way, because the Earth implies a kind of dome as that giant figure and a kind of easily enclosed environment, whereas the reality of that image, sort of hiding in plain sight, is that this sort of 6 sextillion tons of rock that make the actual sphere of the Earth are not habitable. And what's actually habitable is this kind of tissue-thin area around the surface, and that's a very different and much more kind of fragile picture than this easily systematized. The figure of the sphere is one which is, it kind of implies a controllability, which I definitely connect, Janette, to your mentioning of these sort of geoengineering proposals that imply a kind of ready systematization of this spherical surface. But I wanted to ask Janette about her feelings about the surface of the dome versus the interior, and maybe where you would locate your project inside or on top or around.
Definitely under.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the dome for the purposes of that project becomes more of a framework for talking about what's included and what's excluded from the set of equations that one would want to consider when you talk about ecology, rather than the literal enclosure. And I do think I wanted to pick up on the question of limits as well, because I thought it was interesting that throughout many of the discussions today, I think there was this kind of idea of catastrophe, there was this kind of idea of limits, there was this idea of error, or this notion that things are in a way kind of out of control. And so I think to get back to your question, Meredith, I'm interested in the way that metrics does play a very, very dominant role in our ability to evaluate what should be counted and what is part of the set of issues that one has to consider with regard to ecology or environment. And so in your case, the history of GIS then becomes a kind of way in which we would then start to understand the layers which produce this kind of ecosystem. And then at the same time, you see a complete lack of ability to quantify anything, that with risk, with uncertainty, one finds that we not only do we not know what's going to happen, we don't even know which variables we should count. And so anyway, I'm just curious to see how the histories of metrics come in, or how those questions of what should count or what is part of the dome, that is part of that sphere, arise. And I think that to me is the question. That's the question of judgment, centered around the metric.
Maybe, Edward, I had a question for you, which was whether you have a position on the breakdown in Linnaean nomenclature, which a lot of biologists now make a case for, that it vastly oversimplifies a highly complex series of transitions between species and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very nice question, and actually contributes very directly to Meredith's issue of law-likeness of nature. And I mean, just very quickly, one thing I'd say is the politics here is obviously in Linnaeus' text, the polity of nature, the police of nature, and the roles that are fulfilled by various, whether it's insects or carnivores, what have you. But yeah, this is an enormously complex question. I mean, Linnaeus is very clear from the start, this is a system. In the Philosophia Botanica, he writes what he calls a fragment of a natural system, which gets understood by Bernard de Jussieu, Adrien Laurent de Jussieu, and becomes the natural system. But the law-likeness of it happens when the Campbells throughout the 19th century are governing these endless conferences, international conferences on nomenclature. How do we govern this language, which needs to be perfectly communicable and, talk about translation, overcome the enormous problem of synonymy. If she's naming a plant one name, I'm giving it another, who's to know? How do we check? So, at least in my register, that would be exactly the place to ask that question. Can I ask one? Look, I don't want to get off course here, but for obvious reasons, I'm not invited to that many conferences. But the last 3 conferences I've been to in a relatively recent period of time, in all 3, I've seen Earthrise. Okay, yeah. And I'm just fascinated by the recent prevalence or predominance of image. And Susan Buckmore showed that, yes, but she had the OT maps, and to me, that is a view of the Earth. Why? What? We're seeing this for the first time now? Why? What is it about that we're all so?
It was a political artifact. It was it was an attempt to. I think the production of that image. That image was produced through the intercession of Senator Gaylord Nelson, who passed the legislation to produce the first Earth Day in the operational trajectories of NASA. And it was. This is why I really. I guess I showed the image, but I try really to resist it, because it kind of. If we can literally, if our technology allows us to literally behold an image which had only been previously virtually produced, then while the text of the image is how fragile that all is, the subtext is that we can enclose it with our eye, like God can paradise, then we can somehow control or manipulate it. And then although it's really interesting, so the astronauts of Skylab 3. They had a teleprinter that told them what to do every minute of the day. The Apollo astronauts had resisted this, but the Skylab, they were up there for 2 months, and they had to, every fragment, every moment was controlled by the system. And about 3 weeks into the image, they went on strike, and they turned off all the radios with Earth and floated around for 24 hours. And what they did for that 24 hours was not look at the sky, but they looked at the Earth, and they came back and they gave this impassioned environmental message to a congressional committee which nobody attended. So it wasn't, but they had this, and so there was this notion, they had the notion that somehow seeing the Earth had made them into environmentalists. And so it was a kind of, it was an attempt to perpetuate, I think it's obviously a really effective image, but it also in many ways is a kind of fragile and false one that is much a product of the discourse around the environment as it was a kind of generator of it.
Your reading, I'm sorry, let's say, your reading of it right now is enormously elegant, and I've been waiting to hear that, to give that. I understand why, but the resonance of it. But the last thing I'll say on it is just that it seems to me by showing that slide, not you, other culprits are not saying
I'm
something.
guilty.
No, but are not saying something else. It's standing in for something that's just we're not bothering to say.
Yeah, and I think that a kind of constructive contrast is one with the Eames Power of 10 movie. And, my sense of the fiction of that Earth rising image is that it shows the Earth in isolation. And so the reality of the Earth as sort of part of a process of exchange of different forms of energy, for example, is absolutely written out of the picture. And while, that may the Eames Power of 10 project, the idea of a kind of continuity across scales and certain strange resonances when you get to the extremes, I think paints a far different picture.
Well, how do I engage with the environment as an architectural historian? I teach, most of the students that I teach come from architecture, and they engaged with the environment largely through the discourse of sustainability in the design studio, where they engage with sustainability through performance-based paradigms such as LEED, cradle to cradle, and some of the other paradigms that we discussed today. I guess, and when they come into the architectural history survey class, we're still talking about the Parthenon in really very formal visual aesthetic terms, and not really discussing an ecological history through the survey. And so for me, I guess the challenge would be to engage with environmental histories right at the survey level and use it as a platform to pose humanistic questions such as why do civilizations disintegrate when there's not distributive justice in, let's say, distribution of resources like water or energy. So I guess that's one way that I would engage with environmental histories on a day-to-day basis.
Mhm. I think that sort of points toward a second question where I wanted to kind of connect this back to some of the other conversations in the conference. And that was to ask if the panelists would respond to Simon Sadler's reading of contemporary architecture as having turned towards pragmatism. And I wanted to couple that with Penelope Dean's characterization of the discipline as being polarized into, and I could have read this wrong, but polarized into the green or digital camps. And so I think being on the environments panel, you're sort of indicted in that, in those readings. And so I wanted, and that includes the historians too, if we remember Sadler's presentation. So I wanted to use this discussion as a chance to either defend or confirm those characterizations.
I guess I actually see a kind of backdoor sort of similarity between those two camps, and it has to do with strange numbers and bad math. And I mean, that's really all I have to say. I mean, to be honest.
I think, you know, they're the same in many ways, the two sides of the same coin, those who advocate, you know, for a system out of balance and those who advocate for the ability of the system to encompass and rebalance the world are in some ways falling victim to the same worldview.
Yeah, I mean, I like Alan's comment very much. Bad math, because if you think about, going back to your question, Nicholas, if you think about what gets us from Linnaeus to Darwin, it's botanical arithmetic. It's understanding the distribution of natural kinds numerically, statistically, and those numbers had to be got and interpreted.
I think to pick up on that, it seems like there's a dialogue between this idea of optimization and trade-off here. Because, Nicholas, if you were looking towards a certain method of analysis as a tool of optimization, and then this reading of Eden or Linnaeus' version of Eden, this amazing idea of trade-off that one organism is necessarily going to be kind of put out by the growth of another. And I'm curious if that then becomes a debate that sort of stops this kind of emphasis on the balance of nature, let's say, or a return to a conserved position. And is there a tension there
I
between
think
the two?
that I mean, it's very interesting to look at attempts to optimize the city and look at them in terms of with the same, they have some of the same qualities of conservation in a way. I think we don't like to really understand that nature is a highly contingent, highly, you know, it depends on luck, on circumstance, and that we tend to look with what Gould, to say for the second time today, talked about the Panglossian paradigm as an attempt to say that nature is perfect as it is, and therefore, you know, as in Candide's Dr. Pangloss, and he really, his coining of the phrase acceptation was part of a larger product of fighting against this notion of the world as being the best it ever was, and rather part of a project of saying the world happens to be the way it is. We can make decisions about it, but we shouldn't expect that those decisions are, you know, will produce a rise or necessarily continue to fall.
Yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful response. The only tiny thing I'd add to that is, my own perspective is, just using Pangloss with Lisbon, to me it's the model of history. It's either, you know, catastrophism, Neptunism, volcanism, or it's what I think we all hold, which is uniformitarianism. And with that, then we have access to how things change and these contingencies as part of a larger picture.
I'm afraid we're going to have to end there, but thank you so much for sharing your time and
Thanks
your
for having
ideas.